And I'm Sheffield Hale, and I'm president and CEO of this illustrious institution, the Atlanta History Center. And I want to welcome y'all here tonight to our Atlanta History Center's book talk. Tonight we have Jim Cobb, who will be discussing his new book, C. Vann Woodward's America's Historian. If you've not yet purchased a copy of your book, you can do so at 25% off tonight, and Jim will sign it for you for no additional charge. We'll also have some times after this for questions. Please turn off any of your phones if you have those, and I'd appreciate it. Now to introduce our guest. Jim Cobb is a former president of the Southern Historical Association and a longtime professor of Southern history. He has written several previous books, including The Selling of the South, The Southern Crusade for Industrial Development, 1936-1990, The Most Southern Place on Earth, The Mississippi Delta and the Roots of Regional Identity, A Way Down South, A History of Southern Identity, and The South in America Since World War II. He is a member of the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame and a recipient of such prestigious awards as the Georgia Author of the Year History, the Woodward Franklin Award for Excellence in Historical Writing, and the Governor's Award in the Humanities. He is currently the B. Finney Spalding Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Georgia, which as a former graduate I can confirm is the best place on earth to receive a history education. Please join me in welcoming James C. Cobb.
Thank you, Sheffield, and thanks to all of you people for showing up on a rainy night like this. Kind of reminds me of the former governor of Mississippi, Ronnie Musgrove, told a story about when he gave his first political delivered a Jim Dandy stem winder of a speech, and the crowd just went wild. And so when it all settled down, everybody had left. One of his uncles came up to him, and he said, "Ronnie, I want you to remember something." He said, "Yeah, Uncle Fester, or what it be, you know, what is it?" He said, "The number of people who show up to your funeral is still going to have a whole lot to do with the weather." So I realized, that it took an extra little push for y'all, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here at the Atlanta History Center, and I appreciate all the opportunities I've had to work with the Atlanta History Center over the years. There's not much that I'm prouder of than the interactions I've had with this institution. I realize that to a number of you, the idea of reading a book about a historian, you may be questioning why you would want to read a book about a historian who's been dead for 22 years, written by another historian whose look suggests he might well be dead himself. To you and other lurking skeptics of your ilk, I will simply say that Comer Vann Woodward is worth reading about primarily because we would surely search in vain for another 20th century American historian, or for that matter, a scholar of any disciplinary stripe, who wielded such influence and enjoyed such deference and respect within the academic sphere while achieving such prominence outside it, much less maintain both for nearly so long. Nor did Woodward acquire or retain his lofty stature as either a professional historian or a public intellectual by resolutely steering clear of crises and controversies. A tireless advocate for his 20s until his 90s, he compiled an astonishing record of direct involvement in crusading for racial integration, defending civil liberties and academic freedom, and combating abuses of power in the highest echelons of government. In this, he revealed a personal commitment to changing the present, that his writings about the past often seem calculated to inspire in others. Such an expansive record of intellectual achievement and social activism seems to say the least improbable for someone born in rural Arkansas during the first decade of the 20th century, raised in its Klan-infested communities, and educated in its public schools. Nor did his 2 years at a tiny Arkansas Methodist college, or the 2 that followed at another Methodist institution, Emory University, then still very much the domain of the uber-rich and not exactly a barrel of laughs Candler family, seemed likely to launch such a career. More than 30 years after he graduated from Emory, Woodward bore few fond memories of the school itself. "I remember this day," he said, "the depressing effect the place had on me, particularly the cloying politeness and the vacuous hostility of the place." In reality, though, his time at Emory and his experiences in his early 20s in a restive and occasionally turbulent Atlanta in general had affected him profoundly, leaving him both wiser to the ways of the world and determined to change the ones he found unjust. He had shown an enormous appetite for literature even before he entered college, and he found that appetite simultaneously nourished and whetted in innumerable late-night sessions with Ernest Hartsock, a talented poet who published his own literary magazine, and Emory debate coach Glenn Rainey, who was an aspiring writer himself. Rainey was also an outspoken critic of the racial persecution and political intolerance he found rampant in the city and throughout the state, and he would go on to form a close relationship with the fiery and forthright Lillian Smith. Rainey provided a glimpse into his own character and values and how they may have influenced his young friend from Arkansas when he observed that it takes more guts and imagination and largeness of spirit merely to stand for the elementary decencies in the South than it does to make a revolution anywhere else. Woodward's own growing inclination towards social activism would surface shortly after he had graduated from Emory in the spring of 1930. But before that, through the auspices of his socially conscious and superbly connected Uncle Comer M. Woodward, who was then Dean of Men at Emory, his namesake nephew would meet John Hope, a strong and determined black leader who served as president of Atlanta University, and Dr. Will Alexander. Alexander was then head of the Commission on Interracial Cooperation, a group formed in the hope of easing racial tensions after World War I, whose members included both John Hope and Comer Woodward. Young Van had joined both Glenn Rainey and his uncle Comer as one of the 62 signatories to a statement that condemned the arbitrary arrests and harassment of Communist Party spokesmen in Atlanta in the summer of 1930. Pointedly rejecting the revolutionary philosophy and tactics of the Communist Party, the statements nonetheless demanded that party members should be protected in their constitutional rights of free speech and assemblage. Woodward would soon take a much bolder step on his own by taking up the cause of Angelo Herndon, a young black communist organizer who was arrested in July 1932 on trumped-up charges of violating an antiquated statute originally enacted in 1833 after Nat Turner's rebellion against inciting insurrection. Herndon's offense was helping to organize a rally that drew 1,000 jobless Atlantans of both races to the Fulton County Courthouse to demand immediate relief. He was summarily convicted, albeit with a recommendation for mercy, which in the Georgia of that era spared him the electric chair but consigned him to prison for 18 to 20 years. Woodward had been in the middle of a visit to the Soviet Union and other parts of Europe when Herndon was arrested. Throughout his excursion, he had found himself thoroughly discomfited by the recurrent and more than faintly accusatory questions he encountered about the Scottsboro case, which involved 9 young black men in Alabama falsely accused of rape in 1931. And the case itself had become quite an international cause célèbre. This constant subjection to the third degree about the Scottsboro affair was enough, as he put it later, to spur him to do something about such incidents when I got back. The Herndon case afforded him the opportunity to do just that upon his return to Atlanta. The Herndon affair struck Woodward as another thing that is going to disgrace us abroad, just like the Scottsboro case, and he joined a number of local Communist Party members in trying to organize a defense for Herndon. Because the group was casting about, as Woodward put it, for people with reputable credentials, in the chaos all too typical of such party gatherings, as a young English instructor at Georgia Tech, he was catapulted into the committee chairmanship, a post he had not sought and one in which he was quickly outdone by the communists who effectively took over the group and sought to manipulate it and him for their own ends. He was mortified to see what was meant to be a confidential comment about his kindly benefactor Will Alexander's unsuitability for playing a role in the Herndon defense effort turn up in the Daily Worker a few days later. Though he claimed to have learned a lesson about associating with communists, there he was 2 years later rubbing shoulders with pistol-packing party organizer Don West during the 1934 textile strike in North Carolina, while pleading the workers' case in the student newspaper at the University of North Carolina. Scarcely 3 years out of graduate school in 1940, he was testifying before Congress at age 31 in behalf of banning the poll tax. Some 40 years later, he would offer a prophetic warning to a House of Representatives subcommittee considering legislation to revise or extend the Voting Rights Act of 1965, cautioning that narrowing the purview of the act would open the door to widespread efforts to abridge, diminish, and dilute, if not emasculate, the power of the black vote in southern states. There were numerous other episodes related to the Vietnam War, the Watergate affair, and the impeachments of both Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton in the course of a career of public activism that had been launched in Atlanta and would proceed unbroken over the span of 7 decades. If the prospect of Woodward becoming a social activist had seemed most unlikely when he arrived in Atlanta, in reality, the odds against his becoming a historian were actually even longer. His overriding passion was literature at that point, and it would remain so for quite some time, while his only exposure to history as a discipline at Emory had come in a single, abysmally dull course that had been, in his words, more than enough to discourage further curiosity. He performed brilliantly when the subject matter inspired him, but his selection of courses was seemingly whimsical and random. He received Emory's first ever bachelor's degree in philosophy, largely as a consequence of having haphazardly accumulated the requisite credits in that field. A few months after graduation, he'd stumbled just as unwittingly into a job teaching English at Georgia Tech. Though he had no intention of making a career of it, or of anything else at that point, for the time being, the situation at Tech suited him just fine. Once he had his class preparation down, he reported, his teaching duties were requiring less and less time, which leaves me leisure for a rather prodigious amount of reading that I'm doing. Only with great deal of effort did Will Alexander manage to prod him into accepting a Rosenwald scholarship to pursue a master's degree at Columbia in 1931. He had left for Columbia with little but the vaguest idea of what he was going to do once he got there, and after another stint of aimless meandering through the curriculum, he settled, largely by default, on a concentration in American government. Although slipshod and superficial at best, his MA thesis on Alabama Senator Thomas Heflin did at least plant the germ of an idea about a book on Southern demagogues that would eventually become his biography of Georgia populist firebrand turned bloodthirsty racial and religious hate-monger Thomas E. Watson. After finishing up at Columbia and spending the summer of 1932 in Europe, he returned to his teaching duties at Georgia Tech and devoted his spare time to roughing out his biography of Watson. He was comfortably settled into this routine in the spring of 1933, only to have his reverie shattered by a notice that, owing to a massive cut in state funding, he was being laid off at Georgia Tech. With that, he moved in with his parents down in Oxford, where his father was dean of Emory Junior College, resolved to make the best of his free time by getting as much writing done as possible. His personal funds were soon exhausted, though, and he reluctantly settled on enrolling in the history PhD program at the University of North Carolina, not because he by any means aspired even to earn a degree, much less become a professional historian, but solely because he needed some sort of fellowship support until he could finish his book. This he was fortunate enough to acquire through the offices of the ubiquitous Will Alexander, whose intercession with the famed UNC sociologist Howard Odum yielded a handsome stipend for his protege, courtesy of the General Education Board of the Rockefeller Foundation. Though he did not relish the prospect of studying history, Woodward at least entertained the hope that in doing so he might encounter something akin to the surge of innovation and creativity that was rocking the Southern literary world in 1934. To his great dismay, however, most of the professors he encountered seemed to see preparing graduate students in Southern history as primarily a matter of catechizing them in the accumulated wisdom of their elders, as found in musty old volumes written at least a generation earlier and left to languish wholly unrevised in the interim. Plodding through the likes of these, the thoroughly frustrated Woodward wondered if he had ever encountered prose so pedestrian, pages so dull, chapters so void of ideas, whole volumes so wrong-headed or lacking in point. Persuading that becoming a professional historian would mean little more than a lifetime dedicated to inflicting such reading on innocent youth, not to mention himself, he recalled spending many a night during his first semester pacing Chapel Hill's legendary Franklin Street, debating whether I might fare better as a fruit peddler, panhandler, or hack writer. Despite complaining that attending classes and meeting other program requirements had thrown his writing completely off schedule, Woodward continued to indulge his passion for literature. Both he and Rainey immediately devoured anything written by Thomas Wolfe, for whom Woodward later professed such warmth of affection that Wolfe's death in 1938 had caused him personal grief. On the other hand, he harbored no such feelings toward a certain Atlanta novelist whose story about how a tart little bitch gets all the men in North Georgia in rut triggered such a violent muscular contraction in the esophagus that he was forced to abandon it only 118 pages in. He saw no need to keep at it, he explained to Rainey, because one doesn't have to drink all the sea to call it salt. As he suffered through his course assignments, complaining of having 7 6/7 volumes to go in a dreary 8-volume history of England in the 18th century, he still found energy and time to tear through a 2-volume set on English literature and a Saturday Review essay on William Faulkner's Sanctuary. Woodward's intense admiration for the thought-inspiring creative imagination of writers like Thomas Wolfe may have stoked his frustration with the insistence of his professors that the historian must master all the factual details of human events before addressing their larger meaning. In any case, his tongue was not entirely in cheek when he complained to Rainey that history, I find, is a collection of facts. Should have looked into that before going so far. Nothing but contempt for facts, opinion all that matters, proper attitude. Even Carlisle Citizen, who was Woodward's best friend in graduate school, admitted that his chum had little zeal for mastering the bricks and mortar of historical information and simply did not know many facts of history. Bennett Wall, another grad school colleague, agreed that Woodward was a great ideas person, but never a nuts and bolts man. After cutting classes with abandon and putting off his instructor's assignments until the very last minute, with his formal PhD offerings in orals in the offing in the spring of 1936, He had no choice but to frantically beg and wheedle notes from his classmates at the last possible minute. His aim, as one of them put it, was learning just enough to pass those examinations in order to retain his Rockefeller funding. By all accounts, among his faculty examiners, the only one who felt he had even come close to passing was his brand new dissertation advisor, Howard Beale. According to legend, at least, Woodward had dismissed numerous questions on topics about which he knew nothing and cared even less by saying something like, "I don't know, I was never much interested in that." And it was only Beale's protracted filibustering in his behalf that saved him. Even so, he seemed not the least bit humbled by his experience when he claimed the next day after the exam to be indulging myself in the dubious pleasure of some extravagant forgetting. No niggardly date here and a dictator there, but whole dynasties at a time. Poof, there go the Habsburgs. Poof, the Hohenzollerns. I made the mistake of forgetting the Hanoverians before the Orals. A continent or two, an ocean of diplomacy, a library of books. Alcohol proves an excellent solvent for the unused impedimenta of information after examinations. In the end, though, his single-minded focus on completing his Tom Watson biography paid off in a dissertation that was submitted to Macmillan Publishing in May 1937 and published less than a year later with scarcely a trace of revision. Despite the favorable response to Tom Watson, Agrarian Rebel, in academic circles, his indifferently acquired PhD in history remained largely an afterthought until its dismal sales of only 559 copies in its first year in print finally shattered his wishful illusion of making a living strictly as an independent biographer. With that, the stage was set for arguably the most pivotal of all the timely and fortuitous twists that were to become the hallmark of his long professional career. Despite some initial qualms about Woodward liking his liquor quite a little better than he should, in March 1939, the editors of the New History of the South series invited him to write Volume 9, encompassing the period 1877-1913, after the author originally chosen for the book abruptly withdrew from the project. Woodward leapt at the chance to have my say about the period, but due to the onset of World War II and other delays, the volume would not appear until 1951, although it would soon prove itself worth the wait. The research effort behind Origins of the New South was massive enough to produce another book, Reunion and Reaction, a boldly revisionist take on the Compromise of 1877, which ostensibly brought down the curtain on Reconstruction. Yet it was Origins, a commanding synthesis of a little explored period that challenged the dominant, thoroughly whitewashed New South historical account of that era, that would quickly establish its author as the leading authority on Southern history since the Civil War. Meanwhile, the book that would fuel Woodward's meteoric ascent to prominence beyond the Academy grew out of 3 hastily written lectures delivered at the University of Virginia in September 1954, scarcely 4 months after the Supreme Court's landmark school desegregation ruling in Brown versus Board of Education. The lectures were rushed into print essentially verbatim by Oxford University Press in April 1955 as The Strange Career of Jim Crow. Looking to rally active support for enforcing the Brown Decree, Woodward took issue with the long-standing conviction, even among those who favored integration, that rigid, thoroughgoing racial separation had been an elemental fixture in Southern life far too long to be eradicated by a mere Supreme Court decree. Contending instead that consistent, strictly enforced segregation dated back little more than 50 to the Jim Crow statutes of the 1890s, Woodward encouraged readers to believe that as a creation of its own right, and a fairly recent one at that, segregation could surely be eliminated by the same means. His thinking, he later explained, was that if he could persuade reluctant would-be activists that racial segregation in the South originated not in ancient habit or custom, but in a legal framework constructed scarcely half a century earlier, they might take hope that segregation was not all that invulnerable. Contrary to what remains a widely circulated legend, although Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made note of the strange career of Jim Crow in the speech he delivered in Montgomery at the end of his storied march from Selma in March 1965, he did not, in fact, anoint it as the Bible of the Civil Rights Movement on that occasion. More's the pity, for the book's author, who was in the crowd that day, had seen it providing just the sort of inspiration such a designation would have implied. Whatever its merits as an inspirational tract, however, as a piece of scholarship, The Strange Career of Jim Crow was an epic fail. Not only did its sweeping attack on the traditional assumptions about the origins of segregation rest upon just 8 quoted sources, but although the absence of footnotes made it unlikely most readers would detect this, Woodward had cherry-picked these sources with such surgical precision that the words he shared in the text were as often as not contradicted by others, not only within the same paragraph, but even in adjoining sentences. The scant support he could marshal for his thesis that Southern race relations had remained surprisingly fluid prior to the passage of the Jim Crow laws was so overwhelmed by the conflicting evidence uncovered by other historians that by 1970, historian David Hackett Fisher showed no hesitation in declaring that Woodward's thesis had been proven wrong in all its major parts. Still, regardless of whether they bought his argument, a great many Americans still bought his book, which became the most widely read account of American race relations published in the 20th century. It would appear in revised editions in 1957, 1966, and 1974, and go on to sell in the neighborhood of 1 million copies, simply because with each new edition bringing the struggle to end segregation up to date, it offered the best, and for quite some time the only, brief and reliable narrative of, if not the origins of Jim Crow, then certainly his rise, dominion, and demise at a time when it could hardly have been more relevant. Well into the 20th century, Southerners writing about their region's past in any genre were expected to hew tightly to the tenets of a highly orthodox historical creed aimed at rationalizing the South's current racial, political, and economic system as the most logical and viable extension of strategies devised to help it overcome the devastation and havoc wrought by the Civil War and Reconstruction. Between 1938 and 1955, Woodward had challenged this narrative and the sense of legitimacy it conveyed on the present order in 4 books, which, as historian Richard H. King noted with little exaggeration, collectively revolutionized the established views of Southern history from the end of the Civil War to World War I. This was no small achievement for someone who had once steadfastly rejected even the notion of becoming a historian. Yet, in another striking twist, at age 46, with nearly half his life and 2/3 of what proved to be an extraordinarily long and productive career still before him, the man now seen as the reigning eminence in his field had published his last book-length, originally researched work of history. There would be an abortive attempt to write a book on Reconstruction and a handful of important articles for major professional journals over the next 40 years. But only one of those gave evidence of relying on research conducted after 1951. Going forward, Woodward's written contributions as a historian, arguably some of the greatest he would ever make, were to come elsewhere in scores of essays, commentaries, and opinion pieces, appearing in widely read publications ranging from the New York Times to the New York Review of Books, Harper's, Newsweek, and Time. A number of these would resurface in published collections of his writings, the best known being the enormously engaging Burden of Southern History, where he deftly explored the nature of both Southern and national identity and the vital importance of each to the other. Though never hesitant to address the South's historic wrongs and enduring flaws, as several essays in this collection revealed, he maintained a powerful and unapologetic emotional attachment to his downtrodden native region, and frequently reminded its self-righteous northern critics, that their own backyards could use a little bit of work themselves. Despite the book's title, its contents offered as many lessons for Americans outside the South as within it, including his precocious warnings about the inherently dangerous presumptions of a peculiar national virtue and invincibility that sustain the mythology of American exceptionalism. These cautions were borne out repeatedly as the nation endured the tragedy and folly of intervention and escalation in Vietnam, the explosion of wanton racial violence and rage in its central cities, and the humiliation and disillusionment of the Watergate scandal. A comprehensive tally of Woodward's writing aimed at readers outside the traditional academic realm would offer a veritable laundry list of the critical national and international issues that concerned Americans in general at one point or another over the better part of his 91 years. One might have predicted that at some point Woodward's growing popular appeal would either undermine his lofty standing among his academic colleagues or, as it seemed to do with Arthur Schlesinger Jr., encourage Woodward to abandon that calling altogether. Yet, if anything, the effect was just the opposite. After securing a position at Johns Hopkins immediately after the war, he had politely resisted the advances of a formidable procession of ardent academic suitors before Yale came calling with the offer of a prestigious Sterling professorship in 1960. Between Hopkins and Yale, he would direct more than 40 PhD dissertations to completion. Among their authors were 3 future Pulitzer laureates, not to mention many others who garnered all manner of prestigious awards too numerous to cite. Others have directed more dissertations, certainly, but surely no American historian has managed over a 3-decade span to attract and train a collection of graduate students who, as a group, registered a more substantial impact on their field. His noted generosity in reading and commenting on the works of dozens of others at various stages in their careers, and his nearly 4-decade tenure as the editor of the multi-volume Oxford History of the United States make it even more difficult to exaggerate Woodward's importance to scholarship in American history during the last half of the 20th century. Woodward's contributions to the profession earned him an extended tenure as an unrivaled power broker and influencer in historical circles and beyond. His word carried enormous weight in decisions about who was hired and promoted and whose book was published, reviewed in the right places, and garnered major awards, particularly the Pulitzer. Trading on the deference he enjoyed, he did not blink at reviewing books written by his own students, at least 13 of them by my account. In this, his career offers a rare glimpse into the intricacies and subtleties of high-altitude academic politics and how academic elites function and retain their status, even as rapidly shifting ideological and methodological currents seem to shake the very foundations of their respective disciplines. Extraordinary as the stature he achieved within his own grudgingly chosen profession might be, the broader importance of Woodward's story lies in the insights it offers into major developments and trends in American intellectual life and public affairs over the better part of the 20th century. At the outset of his career, his readiness to buck the established narrative in Southern history set him apart from the overwhelming majority of the white historians who had preceded him. Yet in his mind, surely, this mindset put him in the infinitely preferable company of William Faulkner, Thomas Wolfe, and Robert Penn Warren as part of the so-called generation of 1900, a distinguished cadre of gifted and independent-minded Southern writers born primarily between 1890 and 1910. This literary cohort had emerged near the end of the 1920s as modernist challengers to what was at heart a tightly scripted Victorian vision of past and present, grounded in the conjoined myths of Old South gentility and New South progress. Woodward would step forward a decade later as a historian bent on doing much the same thing, and he readily acknowledged his profound indebtedness to Faulkner, Wolfe, and Warren for conveying the presence of the past in the present so vividly, and thus setting a standard to which he believed all historians should aspire. Meanwhile, Woodward's appreciation of the clarity and grace vital to an effective literary style became a hallmark of his own writing. Flannery O'Connor was hardly given to praising other Southern writers not named Faulkner, but after devouring the burden of Southern history, she reported to a friend that she had taken up reading C. Van Woodward. Southern history usually gives me a pain, but this man knows how to write English. His dedication to clear and accessible writing surely served Woodward well as he led the way along with Schlesinger and Richard Hofstadter in reinvigorating public interest in history by harnessing it to new, more socially purposeful ends. In this regard, no aspect of Woodward's career looms larger than what it says about the importance of how historians perceive the very nature and purpose of their craft, particularly with respect to making their treatments of the past usable for contemporary readers. As it did in the strange career of Jim Crow and his other scholarly writings, Woodward's zeal for reshaping history into a potential catalyst for social betterment in the present led him more than once to claim too much for the relatively slender share of supporting evidence at his disposal, and even to distort it to better suit his purpose. It would take a while, but his willingness to allow what he saw as the needs of the present to color his interpretations of the past finally caught up with him, within the scholarly realm at least. Succeeding generations of historians unearthed mounds of evidence running contrary to many of his interpretations and suggested that he had passed too lightly over the constraining realities of historical context in his search for some more hopeful lesson applicable to his own day. In light of the current angst-ridden debate about historical presentism, it's fair to say that Woodward's zeal for making the past speak to the present sometimes led him to lose sight of the distinctions between the historian's role as an interpreter who first discerns and then passes on what the past has to say, and a ventriloquist who consciously tailors that message according to what he or she feels the people of the present need most urgently to hear. In any case, although Woodward was not about to admit it, many of the principal arguments offered in the 4 books he had written in the first 20 years of his career and later credited with transforming the study of Southern history, had been effectively taken to the historiographical woodshed well before his death in 1999. Yet the critical scrutiny devoted to Woodward's historical monographs over the last half of the 20th century was in a real sense a tribute to the seminal importance of his contributions to scholarship during the first phase of his career. Indeed, the powerful and widespread impulse to test his arguments, evaluate his aims, methods, and assumptions, and follow up on the questions he raised was very nearly sufficient in and of itself to dynamize the study of Southern history since the Civil War for the better part of 2 generations. Even so, Woodward's story is no thoroughly heroic and triumphal narrative from beginning to end. Heavily invested through word and deed in the long battle for racial integration, he was sorely angered in the mid-1960s to see many younger blacks suddenly renouncing the aims and belittling, even undermining, the hard-won achievements of the civil rights movement while embracing the ideal of black separatism. This anger, in turn, fueled his steadfast opposition to separate black studies programs, while he saw multiculturalism and its various outcroppings running counter to America's historic commitment, as he put it, to e pluribus unum. Woodward's steadfast late-career resistance to such developments arising on the left tempted some to stereotype him as yet another young liberal firebrand whose views shifted markedly to the right as he grew older. In reality, though, his fundamental stance on race relations, cultural assimilation had remained remarkably consistent throughout his adult life. Beginning in the 1960s, what he saw on campus and beyond amounted to an outright rejection of some of those most deeply felt beliefs. His bitterness at the disillusioning turn of events mounted in the face of the sustained emotional pounding he suffered between 1969 and 1982, when he lost his only child, his three closest friends, and his wife. Sadder still, perhaps, the timing of these severe personal losses prevented him from savoring some of his greatest personal triumphs. The satisfaction of being chosen to lead both the Organization of American Historians and the American Historical Association in the same year evaporated in the misery of watching his 24-year-old son, Peter, suffering the final ravages of the metastatic melanoma that would claim his life in September 1969. When he learned in April 1962 that he had received the Pulitzer Prize for his revised edition of the Civil War Diaries of Mary Boykin Chestnut, his wife, Glenn, was in the final weeks of her own struggle with cancer. He generally managed to keep his enduring grief over the personal losses he suffered at bay by committing himself to a work regimen more befitting an anxious assistant professor coming up for tenure. He was less successful in bottling up his anger over the direction of his profession and higher education in general, and his frustration at being unable to do much about it. His bruised ego got the better of him in his over-the-top campaign to prevent historian and high-profile Communist Party spokesman Herbert Aptheker from teaching a single no-credit undergraduate seminar at Yale. Meanwhile, his righteous anger at what he saw as a tidal wave of political correctness engulfing college campuses also seemed to blur his judgment, as it did in his largely uncritical endorsement in 1991 of right-wing provocateur Dinesh D'Souza's sensationalized account of multiculturalism run amok in America's universities. Still, signs that such lapses in judgment, discretion, and self-control as marked the final decades of his long life had significantly blemished his reputation or diminished his standing were not readily detectable. His appearances at the Southern Historical Association still brought something of a hush over the proceedings, and on the very last of those visits, in November 1998, those proceedings featured a celebration of his 90th birthday. When Woodward died scarcely a year later in December 1999, the torrent of superlatives unloosed in eulogies, obituaries, and tributes from former students as well as many who knew him only through his writing marked the passing of someone of truly monumental importance. Future Harvard president Drew Gilpin Faust pronounced him the 20th century's greatest American historian. But surely the most meaningful and certainly the most moving tribute Woodward received came 2 months before his death in the form of a remarkable letter from Arthur Schlesinger, Jr. Knowing that Woodward had already spent several months in the hospital struggling to recover from major heart surgery and sensing that this might be his last chance to pay homage to his friend of 4 decades, Schlesinger penned what was more than anything a pre-mortem eulogy, and one surely as fitting and elegant as any offered on Woodward's actual passing. As I contemplate your life, Schlesinger wrote, I hope you will realize how much you have meant to the historical profession. Your preeminence derives partly from the superb quality of your historical writing, but it derives as much from your human presence. Not only had Woodward led the way in upholding the standards of the historian's craft against the nostrums of the passing day, but to Schlesinger's mind, he had rendered even greater service as the conscience of our profession, as well as a vital source of moral leadership, which he added, you have provided unassumingly, effectively, and courageously, and you have inspired younger scholars to do their resolute best to grapple with a mysterious past. Though his enthusiasm for making the past an instrument of change in the present occasionally led him to give short shrift to some powerful historical realities and sometimes fuzzy up the facts in the bargain, whatever might be said about his means, there's no quarreling with the end he pursued in trying to persuade everyday readers that the past could help them make better sense of the world in which their daily lives unfolded. As Schlesinger observed, this lesson was surely not lost on several decades' worth of historians. Although there is no telling precisely how many of them were drawn to the profession over the better part of 2 generations by the exhilarating prospect of following Woodward's lead in drawing on their craft to make a difference in the here and now. Let's just say there's certainly one with whom I am pretty well acquainted. Thank you. All right. It's time for questions. Yes, sir.
Did you know him personally?
I knew him impersonally. He was, I was in his company many times, but I always felt the need to reintroduce myself each time. He never really kind of, and you know, it finally dawned on me that it's not just that he's forgetful and he has people hanging over him all the time, which he did. I mean, he had people who would run up to him and slap him on the back and call him Van, like they, you know, as if they'd been in elementary school together, and he didn't know who the hell they were. But it finally dawned on me after I'd written a couple of things that were published in the Journal of Southern History that directly commented on his work, that he was sort of giving me the business. So I never really tried to get very close to him after that. And he was always polite and nothing offensive about his behavior, but he let me know there was a distance between us. He didn't want to narrow. So.
How long after his death did you decide to write the Bible?
Well, not long, because there were the Rice University put together a symposium celebrating the 50th anniversary of the publication of his Origins of the New South, which came out in 1951. So they invited me to do kind of the kickoff talk, and I decided I knew that Woodward was, of course I knew he was dead, but I also knew that his papers had begun to be processed at Yale. And so I flew up there, and once I got a look of them at them, I knew that, I mean, they were so rich and just full of the kind of stuff I was sort of sharing with you, that there was no way I could resist trying to write a book about him. So I basically started, around 2001, and with a book revision here or there, another book or two. It took me better part of 20 years to actually finish this, and it also took me many a trip to New Haven, which, contrary to what they would have you think, is one of the hardest places to get to in the United States. So, but you can look at me. I was 6 feet tall and handsome when I started this project. So, it took a toll, but it's ultimately proven worth it to me.
Charles Beard was a leader among progressive historians, and did C. Van Woodward have much interaction with him and that school of thought, which saw kind of American history as a kind of a triumphant process? Did he have a critique of Beard and his methods and the school that followed around Beard?
Well, he had already read Beard. I mean, he had read everything before he ever. Howard Beale was a devotee, absolutely, of Beard, and Woodward had already read Beard even before that. And so his early books, they're just shot through with Beardian influence about the economic forces. I mean, Woodward was. Woodward believed that race was essentially a social construction, and he thought that insofar as it was wielded in politics, particularly it was done so in basically to serve an economic interest, and he clung to that idea for a long time, so he had like his reunion and reaction about which is about the achieving the compromise that ended Reconstruction, was all about competing regional economic interests, making alliances with each other, and so he postulated that there was an alliance between conservative Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans, who would support taking all the troops out of the South and subsidizing railroads to build a second transcontinental route across the South and things like that. And so he basically says that the whole issue was the whole reason the cause for the ending Reconstruction was fundamentally economic. So his work was definitely redolent of Beard. All of his early scholarly work. Sir? Broadus Mitchell also, although I think he found Broadus Mitchell a little too much of a romantic when it came to the cotton mill barons. He didn't, I, as far as I know, he never attacked Mitchell or criticized him directly, but he didn't see the romantic aspect of the mill story to the extent that Mitchell did.
Other question?
I'm going to ask this out of total ignorance and everything I know about the man.
I
I've
will
just heard
answer
you
it in the
ask
same spirit.
What's that? Everything I know about the man I've learned in the last hour, but was he admired as much or more for his celebrity as he was for his historical contributions? I mean, that's what I sort of get from this. And, as in any profession, someone who becomes a celebrity, takes on a status that is above those often who are toiling in the trenches and perhaps doing work, beyond what the other person might have done. So is that accurate or is that unfair?
For someone who doesn't know anything about him, that's very insightful.
Okay. Well, you did a good job of trying to,
No,
subtly
he did,
convey
and it's like I talk more about it in the book a little bit, but the first time I ever laid eyes on C. Van Woodward was 1973, and I was in graduate school in Athens, and I just passed my PhD orals, and so the Southern Historical Association was meeting in Atlanta at the Biltmore, so I came over, and lo and behold, I'm kind of standing there, and there comes this guy with white hair. He's got on this tweedy coat that he wore for about 50 years, and I suddenly realized everybody was looking around, and and the conversations were sort of trailing off mid-sentence, and that was C. Van Woodward. And he was on the program. He was chairing a session on the civil rights movement in Georgia, and so the room was packed, and nobody had ever heard of the two guys who were giving papers on the session. The people were just there to see Woodward. I'm persuaded that there were very few people there looking to learn any more about the civil rights movement in Georgia. Nearly so much as they just sort of, wanted to hear Woodward say a few things, and he was a terrible speaker. his mentor Howard Beale told him that he got a teaching job at Scripps College, which was then a woman's college out in California, part of the Claremont thing. And so he says, even now, do go out behind the barn and practice your speech so that you don't talk as though you've got a mouthful of mush. But he would, everybody, they're bringing in C. Van Woodward, they're going to pay him $10,000 to give this big lecture. And people show up, damn, this is going to be great. And then he had no cadence, no sense of cadence. He mumbled, he looked down, never made eye contact. And so he would sit down and you kind of say, I'll just have to wait till it's published. And if you did, you would find it was very brilliant and sensible and everything. But he was a terrible, terrible speaker and terrible teacher, and he hated teaching.
No way.
He made no bones about it. He despised teaching. I mean, except for graduate teaching, and I'm not sure he was terribly fond of that in the formal sense of teaching graduate classes, but. As soon as he got to Yale, he began whittling down his undergraduate teaching load and clamoring for a particular segment of the history department faculty to be assigned only to graduate teaching. And the department chair didn't have any need to ask him if he had anybody in mind when he made that suggestion. So, but he was, his students say that his real brilliance shone through in his one-on-one interactions with them, talking about their dissertations, and he took that aspect of his job very seriously, and he was a very effective mentor, very patient, but firm when he needed to be, and so I will certainly give the devil his due there. But that was a great question. You got any questions about anything else you don't know anything about?
What? I just wanted to respond to that from the perspective of being one of his students at Yale. He was my dissertation advisor, and we did not like him for a celebrity. He was an awesome professor, an awesome teacher, and I was majoring in 20th century U.S. history. I took a class from, I called him Van, so I'll go with that. They never wanted to be called professor. I was majoring in 20th century history. I took a class that he taught and switched my dissertation topic to Southern history. He was just an incredible teacher.
Well, you got the mic. You got the chance to demolish me here now. If I got it all wrong, now's your chance to take your shot.
For those of us of a certain age, reading him in the early 70s while in college, it was an absolute revelation, particularly if you were Southern. It was always sad to hear that a lot of his scholarship had been undermined later, I guess in the next couple of decades. Did he ever respond to the criticisms in any sort of detailed, systematic way?
Well, he got the most criticism by far on the strange career of Jim Crow, and he had this tactic, I would say, of every time somebody wrote a book critical of him, he would search through and find some indication somewhere in there that they at least reiterated something he had said, or that they agreed with him. This part of his thesis, and so he was still doing that. I mean, he basically wrote a book on the spur of the moment that he didn't have any evidence for, and launched this huge argument that basically didn't have much support, and then he spent the rest of his career defending it, rather than simply saying, well, I was just too rushed in doing that. I mean, he eventually did sort of, concede some of that stuff, but he to the very last, he would say, well, yet Professor so-and-so, who had just said that he was fun, elsewhere in his text, the professor said, well, he was basically wrong about this, but, he would say, well, he does find a congruence with my argument about so-and-so. So Woodward was he was very good. You know, he was a good influence in the sense of he taught all of his students to be ready to take criticism, because if they did anything much, they were damn sure going to get it. And he got kind of, as any of us would. I mean, he became, there was he and Hofstadter and a few others became like, the editors of journals started to call them David versus Goliath articles that they'd get about attacking a particular aspect of Professor Woodward's thesis or Professor Hofstadter's thesis. That they became a target of a tremendous amount of criticism that it got, it bothered him and irritated him just as it would any of the rest of us. But at least his public posture, was that's one of the things I'm sure Schlesinger was referring to in his tribute to him. Yes?
Whatever happened to his Heflin biography that he started out before Watson?
It settled away into a well-deserved obscurity. I got it. I got a copy of it on microfilm on interlibrary loan, and he was. I mean, it would show flashes of his humor and his sort of ability to sort of make transitions and stuff. But I mean, it had literally. I mean, it had no real substantive research in it, and of course, it was only a master's thesis. But the whole idea was when he finished that thesis on Heflin, who was not only a noted racist but a really very nativist as well. He got the idea that he was going to write a book with separate chapters on 8 Southern demagogues. He's going to call it 8 for Demos. And one of them was going to be Huey Long, one was going to be Tom Watson, one was going to be Heflin. I can't remember. Jeff Davis in Arkansas, people like that. And but he got so drawn into the Watson story, and literally the story. I mean, he sort of told it as a story, not. I mean, he wrote it as much as a novelist as a historian, because he was focused on the story of how Tom Watson could have been such a brilliant critic of the industrial capitalism and capitalist finance, and then all of a sudden he's there, calling for blacks to be lynched and calling the Pope a fat dago, and getting Leo Frank lynched. I mean, so he kind of made it into kind of a mystery of how this happened to this guy, but he had, it was a story that captivated him, and something I should have mentioned in my talk but didn't, was that just at the time that Woodward was deciding he was going to try to get a fellowship at Chapel Hill, the University of North Carolina acquired Watson's papers. And so they were right there on campus with him the whole time he was there, writing his dissertation. So he complained all the time about how the difficulty of getting any research done when he had it about as easy as anybody ever had, because all he had to do is step a few hundred yards from one building to another, and he could be in looking at Watson's papers. So you have to say, something good certainly did come out of his thesis.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Jim Cobb for being here at the Atlanta History Center tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
And if you don't yet have your copy of the book, there's still some for sale out in the lobby, and we will meet you outside if you would like your book signed. Thank you so much.